Good morning.
Morning.
So, I'm an IT guy, and as most people in organizations know, IT guys live in their own world. But I'm also an academic, and everybody blames academics for being in the ivory tower, right? So, we always have this challenge of dealing with reality. But I'm going to do my best and give you a little view of my view of the whole technology space and sort of short-term sense of where it's going. Talking about what Marshall said about the e-commerce thing. As you may recall, 1995 was just about the time the internet went commercial, and and I was at Vanderbilt then, and we decided to launch this program, and people thought we were crazy. Why would anybody be dealing with the internet? I mean, it was for techies doing research and stuff like that. And it was amazing that within 3 years, by 1998, not only was it becoming very popular, and we had the whole dot-com boom, but just about every major business school in the country was looking at the space and thinking that they really needed to get into it, which was kind of what brought me to SMU. But an interesting side note is that I had students at the own school that I remember some of them came to me like the 98, 99 time frame. And one of them in particular said, she said that she was in a real quandary, and I said, what's going on? She said, well, I'm trying to figure out what I should do. And I said, well, e-commerce is a hot area, you should do very well. And she said, well, that's a problem. She said, I'm sitting on over $10 million of Amazon stock. And I'm trying to figure out why should I do my MBA. So those were the days, as they say. and anyway, but it was absolutely fascinating. I mean, I remember once I had Brad Martin, who was the CEO of Saks at that time, came by and had a student with him, one of my students, and our students in the MBA program, they go for an internship in the end of the first year, and so he had gone in for an internship at Saks. And so this was in the fall, and so Brad came by and said, I need to talk to you about this guy, and he said that he wants to come back and finish his MBA, but I want to see if we can hold on to him for a little bit longer, and could you possibly defer his MBA by a year? And I said, I'm not the person you should be talking to, and that's the admissions, the MBA office downstairs, they handle all that stuff. He said, no, it's not that. He said, this kid wants to come back and finish the MBA program. And he said, I got to talk to you to get a sense of whether that would make sense or not. So I said, well, so what's the problem? Why don't you want him to come back and finish the MBA? He said, because he's shaping our whole digital strategy. 25-year-old kid, still in school. And Saks is a pretty big company, right? So it was emblematic of the whole issue of sort of very drastic and dramatic technological change, and how it literally can leave the whole landscape completely so unchanged that there's nothing familiar even to people who've been in the space for a very long time. So I'm not a futurist, or I'm not a soothsayer or anything like that. But what I'd like to do today is I want to do three things. I want to give you a little sense of the technology landscape, the different aspects of information technology that characterize today's environment. And then I want to identify a couple of interesting trends that are happening today. And then I want to finish off by just mentioning a few things, a few implications of this environment and these trends for a few select industries. Hopefully that will be of interest to some or all of you. Again, I don't know your context, so I kind of guessed. I picked a few that I thought might be of interest. Be happy to talk about others as well. So, so the first part, I just want to be kind of go over the different aspects: hardware, software, data, people, networks, and so on, and just give a sense of where things are at today. So one of the things that we see, of course, is this notion of the post. People used to talk about the post-PC world, but really it's a post-computer world, in the sense that increasingly we are finding that computers are not separate devices. I mean, it used to be there was a computer. It was a whole room. It got smaller, got more powerful, and all that, but it was still a separate device. Today, what's happening is that computers are being integrated into all kinds of other systems, devices, appliances. And so the notion of what you think of as a computer is changing. A watch is a computer. Your phone is a computer, right? Probably, this building is in some ways a computer. So not only are we having all these different things begin to embed what we think of as computers, and these are now intelligent and they can interact with us, but in addition they're also interacting with each other, and that's making for a very interesting computing environment today. You're also finding that we as users are increasingly being integrated into the computing landscape. And this is again in a number of ways. So at one level, for example, we're seeing innovations like, let's say, Google Glass, okay, where you actually walk around and you don't think of the computer as this separate device. It's just you just see and interact, and you can perhaps talk to get what you need. You also have even embedded devices in us, whether they're implantable devices that are computing, that are sensing, that are transmitting, that are computing. And then we also have an environment where, again, this notion of integration is virtual, in the sense that, let's say today as we walk into a store, there is neural marketing going on, where you can actually sense people's faces and you can recognize them. You can be walking on a street and you're being monitored, and there's this computation going on that's involving recognizing you, understanding you, serving you, that's happening, without you even being aware of it. So in all kinds of ways, this notion of the separate entity sitting on the table or in that room is no longer there, and that's changing how we think about computers. Where is this notion of location in terms of home, office, work, store? That's also changing, right? Because as technology has shaped itself in terms of all these different appliances and devices, have become more portable and mobile, these notions of locations, we can literally take everything that we need with us wherever we are. So this notion of well-defined spaces and static spaces is growing, and I'll come back and revisit this notion again. So this notion of intelligent devices is again, I alluded to it earlier, but computers are becoming part of just about everything that we use, and that is changing how we think about these devices, but also how we think about computing. So, for example, your refrigerator is a computer. Your car is a computer, and your house is a computer. And then as we start implanting devices in us, we are a computer, right? So it's all these different devices and appliances that are becoming actually the more interesting aspects of what we think of as a computing environment, not the PC or the laptop or even the mainframe for that matter. we have this whole notion of sort of network computing or distributed computing, so big data, and I'll come back to big data in a bit, but that's being enabled by the evolution of the computing environment to where we've gone from, back in the good old days, it was, you know, very sophisticated, expensive hardware, right? So we had mainframes and supercomputers. We went from those to PCs and laptops, but there was always the idea was, you know, to do more, we had to build more sophisticated hardware. But today it's actually going the other direction. Today the most powerful computers or computing environments are massive networks of essentially commodity hardware, but that are brought together and networked together and integrated into very powerful parallel processing systems that are allowing us to take enormous amounts of data and do very sophisticated processing with them. So again, that's kind of so these are some of the aspects of the hardware that we see in our environment today. Turning to software, I see this big trend towards user-oriented computing. What I mean by that is, if you look at from the standpoint of computing applications development or systems development, as we've gone through generations of software, we've gone from software that was very much oriented towards the machine. So in the extreme case, machine language and assembly language and things like that, where you had to almost think like a machine to program it, to higher and higher levels of computing languages, and each generation is actually shifting the balance from the computer to the human being. So today, application tools and languages are much more geared towards making it effective for the user and having the power in all the layers of middleware and so on, that the computer will figure out what to do, but let's make it better for the human being. And we've gotten to the point where actually now we have even no language computing, in the sense that to develop software and develop applications, you don't even have to learn a language, because you've got these point and click graphical user interface based tools that you can essentially, like Lego blocks, put together applications. And that changes the computing environment. So we also have a setting where we've gone from again very proprietary computing environments in terms of software and systems to a much more open environment. And this has happened in a couple of ways. So one aspect is this whole move towards open source. Okay. Now, how does open source change computing? Well, it makes for a much more effective basis for collaboration, much more effective basis for a constructive, distributed approach to development and innovation, because everything that I develop is available to the next person that wants to then build on that. And so you kind of build layers upon layers, and that makes for a very powerful basis for innovation, because you're not limited by what you have as resources. It's really available to everybody. And while that's very powerful, it also raises challenges, right? I mean, for example, those of you that are familiar with open source software and the whole movement towards using that also know that it's very scary. I mean, if you're developing solutions that are strategic in nature, think about what happens when you use open source software. You're obligated by the kind of license that you have to make that source available to everybody else. Well, so how is it of strategic value then, right? So that's a real challenge. I mean, how do you navigate that space? There's also this whole notion of open in the sense of making everything plug and play, everything very integratable. So used to be that we had this notion of plug and play was, well, you can actually get a Microsoft device that could talk to another Microsoft supported device by downloading drivers and all that kind of stuff, right? Remember those days where every day you had to download new drivers and all that? Well, that's kind of changing too, right? We are becoming where you can plug and play not just with another Microsoft-based device, but really any kind of device. And again, getting away from all those klutzy, drivers and widgets and all those kinds of things. So that's making for, again, a much more dynamic environment. Another trend we see is this notion of gamification. And as the term says, it's like you're bringing in notions of games into not only software, but also into systems. So if you think about what do we mean by gamification? Well, there are a number of different principles that are in games. So the notion of sort of motivation, scores, rewards, teamwork, okay, layers. All of these are very intrinsic to games, whether it's computer games or non-computer games. And what people have found is that people like games. Kids like games, but grown-ups like games too. And it's a very natural metaphor for motivating and organizing not only software, but also systems and also behavior and organizations. So there are gamification principles that are now being incorporated into business processes in organizations. And that makes for some very interesting innovation. And then finally, the notion of apps. It's interesting when the term app became popular with essentially smartphones and tablets and things like that, right? But today, even on traditional computing devices, people talk about apps. Well, what's different about apps? If you think about it, really, an app is, in one sense, just the short form of application, right? So what's the big deal? Well, it turns out that because of the way it evolved and because of sort of the association that we make with it, most of the time when we think about an app, we don't think about the computational aspects of what's going on. Because if you think about it, you take your tablet and there's an app there to do your banking, and you just think about, okay, I'm going to kind of drag this over here and get my money from this investment to that investment and look at my balance and all that kind of stuff. You're not thinking of it as a computer program. You're just thinking about it as a tool, so the functionality is the key. It's not the computation. And this idea of kind of creating a layer where you get away from the notion of it being a computer application to it just being a tool, just like when children play. And right now, these devices become so effective in education because children can relate to them. But I can assure you, a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old is not thinking about a computer when they're playing with an iPad game. But they're doing computation. And they're learning concepts of computation by playing those games. And so that's very powerful for what it means in terms of understanding the notions of computation and its implications. So that's software. If you think of networks, again, we all know about the ubiquity of the internet and all that kind of stuff. But today, again, it's going to move ahead. Cisco's been drumming into us, well, it's the Internet of Things, right? It's the next generation internet where it's not just about computers, it's about everything else. And that's true. We now tie together not only computers, we tie together all these different devices through networks. And so what's happened as a result is that you've gone from that first generation of innovation in terms of open networks, which was TCP/IP and HTML and the internet, to now a multi-layered structure where those get combined with a variety of other technologies, whether it's Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, near-field communications, and a whole bunch of other things that allow for this network environment where things are connected, and they're connected, and we don't think, I'm using Wi-Fi or WiMAX or this or that. It's just connected. We take it for granted. And again, we can focus on what do we need, what can we do with the connectivity, rather than how do we connect. Because that's almost a moot point, right? We're also cutting the cord. Again, used to be the idea of a network was almost implicitly, tying together static devices through wired structures. Once you cut the cord, that changes. That changes not just in terms of what devices you use, but how you plan for and how you use it. I mean, think about it. It used to be when you planned for a space where there were computers, you had like, false floors, and you had wiring, and you had to set up, outlets and all that kind of stuff. Who does that today? Nobody, right? So it's changing how you think about networking. I've kind of alluded to this already, the notion that the network is everywhere, because it's not just the computers that are there that are intelligent and connected, but it's also everything else. And so that's been interesting. And then finally, I want to touch on this notion of the sort of network computing, right? So I call it the revenge of the network computer. I don't know if you remember, but over a decade ago, there were companies that were plugging network computers, which were these really cheap little laptops, right? Or actually sometimes they were desktops. They were really cheap. And the idea was, this is client-server computing. And so we don't need to have, everyone doesn't need to have a powerful computer. We'll have this big server sitting in the back, and we'll have these little client stations that could be cheap. Some of them didn't even have hard drives, right? And what happened? Nobody bought them, right? They just came and went. But guess what? They're back, right? They're back as cloud computing today. Because that's what the cloud computing is all about, right? It's today's client-server computing, except that the server is in the cloud. It doesn't belong to you. You don't need to own it, right? Somebody else deals with it. But you've got literally unlimited computing, unlimited functionality, right? And you can access it from devices which don't have to be powerful, but they end up being powerful just because it's so cheap. I mean, you can use your smartphone and access so many applications, right? Well, the smartphone doesn't actually need to be that smart, but it is. And it is just because technology is so cheap and we want everything. But it's really an environment where it could be a lot simpler. Which, by the way, just as an aside, it has some interesting implications, because while we have a lot of smartphones are not universally, widely available. You can go to developing countries and you find that everyone's got a phone, everyone's got a mobile phone, but very few people have smartphones. And what is interesting is that cloud computing is enabling those people to access the digital revolution in very interesting ways, even before they get that expensive smartphone. That's a pretty powerful notion. Okay, and then what about people? Well, people are part of the IT environment too, right? Well, it turns out today, again, because of some of the things I've mentioned and the trends in technology, everyone can be a developer. What do I mean by that? Well, obviously, if the tools are easier to use, more people can use them. At the same time, it doesn't mean that there aren't requirements for very sophisticated training for developers who can work in today's sophisticated computing environment. So that is there. But at the same time, we are all actually becoming developers. And the way that pans out is through what we call personalization. If you think about it, more and more applications are being developed in a way that you get essentially a template, a skeleton in the basic application. And then you as a user can personalize that to the way you want it. When you do that, you are part of the development process, right? You are developing the ultimate set of functionality that you're getting from that software. So that's again very powerful, because that allows for a much broader base for innovation than in the past. It's not just that it's accessible everywhere. So for example, today, you can have people sitting in far-off places in India, in China, in the Philippines, in Israel, in Africa, who can essentially have access to the same technology, the same information, the same knowledge base that a developer sitting in Dallas, Texas has. And that's a pretty scary thought. It's also very exciting, right? But it's also scary, because there's no way of controlling innovation, of containing innovation. It's kind of out there. It's everywhere. Which is not to say that it's all the same everywhere. I mean, I was just I saw this program recently about this library in I think it was in Kenya or Uganda, and it was a physical library of books that was being maintained by a physician, and he decided that the only way to maintain this really priceless body of knowledge was to literally keep the place going. And there was no power, there's no no way to control the elements coming in and things rotting or drying out and dust settling over everything. But so that's also true. I mean, there are places like that too, where literally any kind of information is at premium. But at the same time, so you got this very interesting disconnect between two kinds of environments coexisting. On the one hand, you could have very primitive settings with very limited information, and maybe even in that same space, you have people who can do the most sophisticated stuff you can imagine, no matter where they are. Very, very exciting and interesting. And then you have this whole notion of, the social network, right? And the social networks plays out in a couple of different ways. So one is that in the IT space, in terms of software development or application development or system development, the social network is changing how things get done. One aspect of that, I talked about open source software. Well, when you combine open source software with the availability of social networks, it's an incredibly powerful environment, because you have these whether it's SourceForge or other open source networks and collaboratory settings, you have people from all over the world that work together. They've never seen each other, but they interact with each other, and they work together and develop solutions. And you can put out a version of a software, and you can just put it out there and put out the fact that you're interested in some innovation, and someone somewhere is going to essentially develop that, and you could become, you could work with them through this network. So for all practical purposes, it's a collaborative, integrated effort. But of course, as we know, the social network actually is also pretty antisocial, right? I mean, it makes for a setting today where people, they don't interact in person. So there's a lot of complaints about the fact that the social network is making us antisocial, that people are kind of cocooning into their own little spaces and and staying in touch with their 10,000 best friends, right? But never seeing them, right? Never interacting with them, and so on. So even though you can do very powerful things, it has some very interesting social dynamics at play. And then finally, data. Anybody recognize that guy? I find a good way to date people. Do you know that? Yeah, we know. It's not Captain Kirk, but right. But anyway, so data is one of the most exciting aspects of technology today, just because there is so much exciting stuff going on in the data space. We all hear about big data. A big part of it is that there's everything around us is generating data that we can capture. There's some really interesting tidbits of anecdotal information that kind of make this put this in perspective. So one is that, for example, if you look at all of recorded data in everything from books to scrolls to whatever else, from the beginning of time till the early part of the 21st century, 2002, 2003, all that amount of data is today captured in less than an hour, less than 1 hour. Okay, it's about 5 exabytes of data, and that's accelerating. There's expectation that that'll be down to 15 minutes in a few years. Okay, that's scary, right? But that's because it's actually data is become sort of almost like it's become incestuous or cannibalistic, if you will. And, data is generating more data, and it's coming from all over the place, coming from all these different sources, from computers, from appliances, from all kinds of devices, from sensors. I mean, just think about how much data gets generated just because you're walking around with your smartphone. And you're making calls, and you're getting data that's being downloaded to your device. I mean, every time that happens, the telephone company actually has data records being generated, which is why, for example, AT&T and Sprint and some of the other companies have just incredibly large, some of the largest databases in the world. But it's not just the telephone companies. Everybody else is collecting data, right? I mean, you've got RFID tags on clothing and products, and everywhere that moves, that's generating data. So all this is leading to a very exciting situation. So now you've got all this data, and we've got sort of a confluence of various factors that make this whole data space very interesting. So you've got, on the one hand, you've got all the data you could want, right? We've got hardware and networks to a point where we have all the horsepower we need to crunch the data. Okay, and again, there's this idea of powerful, distributed computing, things like Hadoop and MapReduce and all the different tools that are being used to kind of pull together all those commodity computers into these powerful networks. That's coming together, and that's enabling processing. At the same time, analytics software has gotten to the point where things that, I mean, I did my doctoral work back in the early 80s, and I used to work in AI, and AI was cool, right? But it was all kind of pie in the sky, right? I mean, you could write papers about it, but very few people actually used it. All of that today is actually being used. It's just not cool anymore. I mean, it's just being used, right? And so we moved beyond the hype cycle, and we've gotten into reality, but reality is not that exciting. It just happens. And so, but a big part of that is what's happening in the analytics space. So things like data mining, for example, predictive modeling, have gotten so powerful that not only can you process large amounts of data, you can do it at a pace that's almost in real time. So what that means is that you can process the data and make decisions so that you can incorporate those decisions into your real-time processes. So let's take organizations, right? You got business processes happening. So if you can take data, huge amounts of data, and process it and incorporate it, now that means that as your operations are occurring, so as your sales transactions are going on, you have very current and applicable information. Now, if you then combine that with empowering the people who are on the front lines, so the people who used to be just clerical staff, the people who are just order takers, the people who are just delivery personnel, now they can be a whole lot more, right? Because they can get the information that's relevant to that particular point of delivery of service that you're talking about. And that can dramatically change how work gets done within the organization, at the interface of the organization and its market, and so on. So that's, again, a very, very powerful development. Okay. So those are, so hardware, software. I talked about, just the different components of what we think of as information technology. I want to just talk about a few, again, by no means exhaustive, but a few interesting trends that have evolved because of all of this. So one of the things that's happening is this whole evolution of what are called platforms. Of course, platforms have been around for a long time, right? I mean, you think about cars are built on platforms, right? I mean, when GM makes all its million versions of its cars, builds those as variations on a small set of platforms. Like when HP makes printers, it makes lots of different models of printers, but it actually builds them all on common platforms. And so, in effect, a platform is a collection of functionality, of components, of subsystems, of sort of the skeletal organization of a system, so that remains stable as you can then bolt on additional pieces and make for all kinds of interesting end products and services. Well, that's great. It's been around for a while. But today what's happening is that in this highly interconnected, networked world that we live in, platforms are taking on new meaning. So some of the most exciting companies in the technology space are companies that have actually developed interesting platforms. Let me take Google as an example. Okay. We think of Google as being a search engine, but actually what Google is building is a very powerful and multifaceted platform. So if you think about where Google is getting most of its money, it's from companies, on a lot of its money, it's from companies that are using, whether it's Google Search, whether it's Google Maps, whether it's Google Data. Okay? It's taking that, the company's taking those resources and building applications, services, products. And then these are delivered to the millions of people who either they interact with directly or maybe in some cases interact through Google. Even more striking is a platform like Facebook, for example. Okay. Now, it took the market a really long time. We're still digesting. What do platforms like Facebook mean? And initially, who cares about a bunch of people just sending photographs to each other and texting and so on and so forth. Well, it was all about people interacting with each other. Well, it turns out that something like Facebook is essentially what's called a two-sided platform. So on the one side, you've got these millions of people that are interacting with each other in rich and varied ways. But then on the other side, you've got companies that want to sell them products and services. And they interact through these same platforms. So now the fact that, let's say, Facebook or Google or any of these companies has millions of people visiting and using the site makes that a very attractive place for companies to come and sell their products and services. And what that also means is that for, let's say, Facebook, there are some interesting choices. Where do you make money? You don't now, for example, do you make money from the millions of people who are using Facebook? Or do you make it from the thousands of companies that are developing applications and products and services that are being delivered to the millions of people? Turns out there's some very interesting what I call network effects that are coming into play, and that creates some very interesting choices for how you design the revenue and business models on these platforms. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. How am I doing on time?
You're okay.
You okay? All right. Another trend is what I call data-driven computing. And that is traditional computing and decision making and so on has been top down. You start with some kind of a theory, a notion of how things work, and then you build a system and then you collect data based on that. Today the whole thing is being upended. The data can drive the models of what happens and what is real. So rather than theory leading to a system which leads to data, you have data that's leading to a theory. And in fact, data that's got the system and then theory. So the whole process is reversed, which again has some very interesting implications for how you conduct business, how you conduct education, and how you learn as a community and as a society. The notion of soft goods. I've kind of alluded to this idea along the way, which is this idea of intelligence being built into devices, right? So when you think about your car, it's a hunk of steel and rubber and plastic, right? That's the traditional notion of what a car is, right? But actually, it's becoming less and less that, and more the end product, which is a collection of the plastic and the rubber and the steel, but also a whole lot of computing and software and data. Now, okay, so what? Well, what that implies though is as that happens over time, the notion of what that product is becomes defined more by the software than by the hardware. And what that in turn means is that now suddenly you can start thinking about those products as platforms. Okay? So now the hardware is just a platform. And you got the software that's coming in and creating all the unique functionality. Okay? That's going to make the product the product. And that's very exciting, right? Because innovation can happen much more rapidly, much more dynamically when it's the software that's being evolved rather than the hardware. The notion of the nomadic life, right? That people change their locations without thinking about context, or rather the notion of context is not location bound, right? And so as a result, not only do you see us as a society becoming more nomadic because we're not tied down to location, but also in terms of how you define things like identity, how you define things like when you take a product. So I talked about soft goods, right? Where does your morning paper get delivered? Where you are, right? Yeah. So the notion of the product has changed, the process has changed, the definition of the service has changed. And if it is delivered where you are, you're not going to be content with information just telling you about what's happening over on the other end of the world. You want information about what's happening there. And so think about what that means for the product. So the newspaper guy has to now know where you are, so they can not only get the product to where you are, but get it in the form that is relevant to where you are and who you are and what you're doing. Okay? So it makes for a very, very dynamic definition of things like functionality, product, service, etc. Okay. So those are some, as I said, there's a whole bunch of other things. I don't have time to get into all of them. Let me just wrap up by talking about implications for a few industries. So let's start with retailing. So if you've been following the news about companies like Best Buy, for example, or Macy's and so on, or JCPenney down the road, right? It's scary, right? Because we don't know where these guys are going to be even in a few years. People are saying that big box, large footprint, diversified retailing in the traditional space is dead or is dying. In some sense, it's inevitable demise. But then you look and say, okay, so who's winning? Well, Amazon maybe is winning, right? And then you say, well, wait a minute. I mean, wasn't the whole e-commerce, e-business thing about democratizing the space, that big players don't have any advantage over small players, right? So it's not clear that ultimately it's going to be the Amazon's going to be the supermarket of the world either. So the notion of what's going to happen in terms of the landscape is, I think, very interesting, and there are all kinds. I don't think there's consensus about where things are going to be in a short time. Money is changing, right? I mean, you'd carry around pieces of paper. I keep being reminded that I still have to carry around pieces of paper every once in a while. But still, think about it. That paper has got converted to plastic, right? To our credit cards and debit cards. But guess what? Even those are going. The next version of your credit card is what? It's the phone, right? And the next version of that, beyond that, is what? It might be your fingertip. It might be your iris, right? It might be, who knows? So what you think of as money as the basis of transactions is changing. And again, that has implications. So for example, take ATMs. We now go to ATMs to extract cash. Where are ATMs going to be? If you don't need the paper, why do you need ATMs? Okay. And so on. So there's, again, a bunch of implications along those lines. The notion of, this whole idea of freenomics. I was talking about platforms, and it does work out, and we've already seen, right? I mean, how many of us pay for our news? We get a lot of news for free. Well, why are they giving out news for free? Well, because somebody may be selling ads, right? Well, think about that's the platform thing, right? Because the company that's selling the news, it gets the audience eyeballs, and then turns out and tells the advertisers, give me money so you can reach those eyeballs, right? So you can see the power of platforms and the flexibility that provides is creating some very interesting notions. So if you think about that, and if your car is a platform, and I'm just kind of throwing it out there. I'm not saying that it's happening today, right? But think about it. If your car is a platform, what should be free and what should be paid for? Should you be getting the car, actually the plastic and steel for free, so then you can pay for the software that's going to define it? Mm-hmm. That would be an interesting change, right? Yeah. And so you can see that it can really change the notion of what gets bought and what gets given and so on. Entertainment. If you look at the entertainment space, there's a huge amount of convergence that's occurring, and that's occurring at two levels. One is that more and more content is being digitized, right? So if everything is in digital form, the notion of separating sort of what is a movie from what is, and we've already do that, right? I mean, Netflix has redefined our notion of watching a movie, right? Or who gets a DVD in the mail anymore, right? So it's that kind of convergence is happening. But beyond that there's also convergence in terms of the devices that we use to access it, right? Now they've found that actually more people watch certain types of video content on their phones than on televisions. And so when that happens, that changes again how you think, right? I mean, the nature of the content that you're going to deliver. If somebody's on a phone, watching it on a phone, they're probably mobile. They're probably sitting at an airport or somewhere else. And so what does it mean in terms of what you deliver? Can they watch a 2-hour movie, or can they watch a 3-minute ad, or does it have to be 15 seconds, right? And so on and so forth. So that changed. And then also in entertainment, we're seeing some very interesting these network effects of what's called crowdsourcing, where people are now developing content. For example, companies are reaching out to their audiences to define what programs should be. Not only what the title should be, who should act in it, how should it be delivered, what should be the beginning, what should be the middle, what should be the end, right? So it's sort of fan fiction and everything beyond, right? It's all changing how media and content and entertainment gets created, and then of course how it gets delivered. If you look at healthcare, again, healthcare is changing dramatically. So one change that's been very significant is this. Again, remember I was talking about this idea of data-driven computing? That's changing also because medicine, if you think about it, traditionally medicine protocols have been developed based on statistics that have been used on vast populations of samples and then developed as protocols for practice. Today it's getting to where John Doe's treatment can be personalized based on data from John Doe and the effect of medications on John Doe, not on 10,000 other people, okay? Which is kind of interesting. Portability and mobility, people now are carrying around more of their information. There's a big move towards the idea of personal health records. That's, I think, going to be very exciting down the road. It's going to upend a lot of apple carts about power and control in the healthcare space. And then, of course, telemedicine, remote medicine, robotics, being able to deliver, again, a more distributed and effective basis for medicine. And finally, I believe some of you are in real estate, so I thought I'll include real estate. And you can see that there are some interesting changes there too. So for example, the idea of smart homes and smart offices. I think again, I'm not a real estate person or architecture person, but I think what's fascinating is that technology is changing again the notion of spaces and facilities and buildings from static entities to much more dynamic entities. So you can, you can reconfigure your spaces, you can change them, and you can innovate. You can take the same physical skeleton and you can innovate in them. You can take a space and redesign it without moving any physical objects, maybe by changing the technological elements in there. The notion of what's a view out of the window. Well, it's not a real window, so you can change it, and things like that. Participative design. I think, again, because of the networked environment where you can have more what's called co-design, you can have people participating in the design of spaces that they're going to use, and not relying upon just somebody else to do it for them, somebody to read their mind and figure out what they want. And then finally, you're seeing a lot more decentralized and remote management of facilities and spaces that's happening, again, because of the networked environment.